My name is Harper Whitford. I'm 28 years old, and for the last 2 decades, I have been the invisible glitch in a family of high-functioning predators. While my sister Sloane was busy meticulously curating a life that looked like a perpetual Ivy League brochure, collecting Harvard degrees and inheritance promises like they were vintage Hermes scarves, my parents, Grant and Penelope, had already written me off as a bad investment. They called me the slow one, with a kind of casual clinical cruelty that stung worse than an open insult. They mocked my dyslexia across hand-carved mahogany dinner tables in our Upper East Side townhouse, over plates of line-caught sea bass and glasses of vintage Bordeaux that cost more than my monthly rent. I was excluded from the high-stakes board meetings that dictated the Manhattan skyline and paid a charity salary that was a literal fraction of what they handed to Sloane. But on this night, under the suffocating weight of the plaza's gilded ceilings, in front of 350 guests who represented the apex of New York's real estate and legal elite, a stranger would hand me a heavy cream-colored envelope. That single document was about to systematically dismantle every carefully constructed narrative my parents had ever spun about my intellect and my place in the Whitford legacy. What they didn't know, what they had been too arrogant to notice while they were measuring Sloane's worth in GPA points and clerkships, was that Grandma Eliza had been watching me with the intensity of a master architect inspecting a foundation. She saw the subtle eye rolls at the Greenwich Country Club, the hushed, embarrassed tones my mother used when explaining my learning difficulties to the neighbors, and the way I was treated like a legacy bug in a premium corporate software update. She saw everything, and she had left me something that would flip the entire Whitford empire, a commercial real estate behemoth valued at exactly $92 million, completely upside down. The Whitfords were the kind of New York family whose name was etched into the marble wings of hospitals and bronze plaques at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. My father, Grant Whitford, was the current sovereign of Whitford Properties, an empire that my grandmother, Eliza, had built brick by grueling brick, starting from a single drafty office in Brooklyn back in 1965. By 2024, that single office had evolved into a fortress of glass and steel, dominating the Midtown skyline. I was born with dyslexia, a diagnosis that hit my parents like a stain on a white silk dress. I was officially diagnosed at 7. To me, the letters on a printed page weren't static symbols of communication. They were a chaotic, vibrating swarm of bees that rearranged themselves into frustrating puzzles. Simple sentences became labyrinthine marathons that took me 3 times longer to solve than any other kid in my private prep school class. My parents' response wasn't a search for support. It was a profound, suffocating sense of shame that they wore like a heavy winter coat in the middle of a Manhattan July. When I was 12, the disparity between Sloane and me became a literal canyon. They hired world-class specialists for Sloane, violin masters from Juilliard, French immersion tutors who flew in from Paris, and a legendary SAT coach from Princeton who charged a staggering $400 an hour to whisper the secrets of the Ivy League into her ear. When I finally gathered the courage to ask about getting specialized help for my reading, my mother, Penelope, just a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 disappointed socialites. She didn't even look up from adjusting her diamond-encrusted Cartier bracelet. "Harper, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a patronizing sweetness that tasted like saccharin. "We've already spent so much on specialists for you. At some point, we just have to accept that some children aren't built for academic excellence. It's about managing our expectations, dear. Not everyone can be a star." I was 12 years old. I didn't hear a mother's concern. I heard a permanent death sentence for my ambition. I believed her because she was my world, and in her world, I was a defective product. So, I learned to adapt in the quiet corners of our 4-story townhouse. Audiobooks became my secret lifeline, my only way to consume the world without the letters fighting back. I developed a proprietary system of visual notes, elaborate color-coded diagrams, 3D mental flowcharts, and mind maps that allowed me to process complex structural data in ways that traditional reading never could. I didn't see paragraphs. I saw the skeletal architecture of logic. Every Sunday afternoon, I would escape the icy perfection of the Upper East Side and take the F train down to Grandma Eliza's apartment on the Upper West Side. Her home was a sanctuary of worn leather, the comforting scent of Earl Grey tea, and the wisdom of 60 years in the Brooklyn trenches. She would sit with me for hours, completely ignoring the diagnostic labels the doctors had slapped on me. She explained business concepts, not through dry, jargon-heavy textbooks, but through vivid storytelling and structural metaphors. "Harp," she told me once, her weathered, age-spotted hand covering mine as we sat by the window overlooking Central Park. "The world will try to tell you that you're slow because you don't process their symbols at their speed. But you see things they miss. You see the structural integrity of a deal while they're still arguing over the font on the contract. That isn't a disability, sweetheart. That is a different kind of vision. The kind that builds empires while others just manage them." I didn't fully grasp what she meant then. I was too busy trying to survive the quiet daily trauma of being the Whitford family's greatest embarrassment. But the fuse was already lit. It all began to detonate on Christmas 2018. 20 relatives had gathered around the 18-foot mahogany table for the annual performance of Whitford Family Perfection. The crystal chandeliers cast a sharp, prismatic light over a catered 5-course dinner, where every laugh was rehearsed and every compliment was a calculated move in a social chess game. My father stood at the head of the table, his heavy crystal glass of vintage Bordeaux raised like a scepter. He had that commanding, boardroom authority that he wore like a bespoke Tom Ford suit. "I'd like to make an announcement," he said, the room falling into a respectful, expensive silence that cost more than a mid-size sedan. "Sloan has been accepted to Harvard Law School on a full merit scholarship." The room erupted into polite, well-heeled cheers and the rhythmic sound of silverware hitting china. Sloan blushed with a practiced, modest grace that she had probably spent 3 hours perfecting in front of a mirror. "My eldest daughter," Grant continued, his chest swelling with a pride that he had never once directed toward me in 28 years, "will be the first Whitford to attend Harvard in 3 generations. She is the future of this firm and the guardian of our family's legacy." More applause. Uncle Richard clapped Sloan on the shoulder with a jovial force. Aunt Catherine dabbed her eyes with a silk Hermes napkin, as if she had personally witnessed a miracle. Then, my father's gaze drifted down the long table to where I sat, partially obscured by a massive floral centerpiece. The warmth in his voice didn't just fade. It evaporated, replaced by a chilly, polite distance that felt like a draft from a basement window. "And Harper? Well, Harper is also here." A few relatives chuckled, that soft, uncomfortable Manhattan laugh people make when they are confronted with a social tragedy they don't know how to fix. Sloan didn't defend me. She sipped her wine with a thin, triumphant smile, basking in the glow of the spotlight as it burned into my skin. I stared at my plate, the slow-roasted lamb and rosemary-scented potatoes blurring through the hot tears I absolutely refused to let fall. Under the heavy linen tablecloth, a hand found mine. Thin fingers, papery skin, but a grip that felt like reinforced steel. Grandma Eliza, seated directly across from me, squeezed my hand gently. When I finally looked up, her eyes weren't filled with the pity I saw in everyone else's. They were filled with a fierce, cold fury, a silent, burning rage directed straight at her own son. She didn't say a word to him, not then. But 3 months later, she called me to her apartment. The atmosphere that day was different. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper, cedarwood, and the unmistakable electricity of an impending storm. I didn't know it at the time, but that Christmas dinner, that single moment of casual, public cruelty in front of 20 elite witnesses, had set a silent clock in motion. A 5-year fuse was burning down, and the detonation would eventually bring the entire Whitford hierarchy crashing to its knees. Grandma Eliza knew something the rest of them had forgotten. She knew that Grant was a man who understood numbers, but I was a woman who understood architecture. He saw the profit, but I saw the flaws in the foundation. She spent those last months whispering secrets to me, not just business secrets, but the kind of tactical psychological leverage that can only be wielded by someone who has spent half a century navigating the cutthroat waters of New York real estate. "They think they've won, Harper," she whispered during one of our final Sundays, her voice raspy but clear. "They think they've defined you. Let them. Let them believe you are invisible, right until the moment you become inevitable." She handed me a small mahogany box with brass hinges that afternoon. "Don't open it yet," she warned, her eyes searching mine for the steel she knew was there. "You'll know when the time is right. You'll know when the betrayal is complete." I took that box home and tucked it into the back of my closet in my cramped Queens apartment, the one I shared with 2 roommates because my charity salary wouldn't allow me anything else. I tried to forget the weight of it, but in the silence of the night, I could almost hear the gears of her plan turning, waiting for the year 2024 to arrive. As I stood in the Plaza Ballroom on Sloane's graduation night, watching my father prepare to announce her as the sole heir to the Whitford fortune, I felt that mahogany box calling to me. I felt the weight of Eliza's hand on mine from 5 years ago. The stranger in the gray suit was approaching me now, cutting through the glittering crowd of Manhattan's elite like a shark through a school of colorful, oblivious fish. The envelope he held wasn't just paper. It was a declaration of war. After graduating from SUNY Binghamton in 2022, a solid state school, but in the eyes of my father, a public sector failure compared to the hallowed, ivy-covered walls of Harvard, I applied for a position at Whitford Properties. I didn't want a handout. I wanted to prove that the family business could be my path too, that my different vision had a place in the empire Eliza built. Grant agreed to hire me, but the offer letter felt more like a slap. I was appointed as an administrative assistant with a salary of $42,000 a year, a figure that, in the predatory rental market of New York City, meant I was living on ramen and generic brand coffee in a cramped Queens 4th-floor walk-up. That same month, Sloane joined the firm as chief legal counsel. Her starting salary? $280,000, plus performance bonuses that exceeded my entire annual income, a corner office with a view of the Chrysler Building, and a signature that carried the weight of the Whitford name. My job, however, consisted of photocopying endless stacks of site surveys, booking conference rooms that I was never allowed to enter, and fetching venti oat milk lattes for executives who looked through me as if I were made of glass. I wasn't invited to a single strategic meeting, I was never shown a single confidential contract. But while they treated me like a ghost in the machine, I was doing something they never expected. I was watching. And more importantly, I was listening. I discovered a hidden rhythm to the business during those stifling, fluorescent-lit hours in the copy room, where the smell of ozone and hot toner became my daily reality. I could spot patterns others missed. When the executives discussed multi-million-dollar deals in the hallway, I'd retreat to my cubicle and sketch complex, skeletal diagrams of the relationships between shell companies, the flow of mezzanine debt, and the potential conflicts of interest hidden in the fine print. The visual system I had developed to survive my dyslexia, the way I translated words into structural logic, had become a high-level forensic tool. Grandma Eliza had been the one to weaponize this skill. During those final Sunday afternoons at her apartment, she'd spread out yellowing, ink-stained contracts from the company's early Brooklyn days and show me how to read them, not as a lawyer looking for a loophole, but as an architect looking for the load-bearing walls of a deal. "Your father reads a contract like a prosecutor, Harper," she told me in the summer of 2019, the humidity of the Manhattan afternoon hanging heavy outside her window. "He looks for what he can exploit. He looks for the kill. But you read them like an architect. You see how all the pieces connect to keep the tower standing. You see where the foundation is cracked long before the first leak appears." That was the day she had handed me the mahogany box, the wood cool and smooth against my palms, its brass hinges gleaming like hidden gold. "Keep this safe," she'd whispered, her voice raspy but carrying the weight of an oath. "Don't open it yet. In the world of real estate, timing is the only currency that truly matters. When you need it, when the betrayal is absolute, you'll know." I'd taken the box back to Queens, tucked it behind a stack of old textbooks in my closet, and tried to ignore the strange, gravitational pull of her secrets. By March 2019, Eliza's health had begun its final, sharp decline. She was 82 then. Her once vibrant frame, which had navigated 1,000 construction sites in heels, grown thin and fragile against the velvet pillow of her armchair. But her eyes, those sharp, slate-gray eyes that had stared down Mayor Koch and the New York Planning Commission, hadn't dimmed at all. "Sit down, Harp," she commanded one evening. I sat across from her in the living room, surrounded by the visual history of her life. Photographs of her breaking ground in Brooklyn in 1965, shaking hands with city power brokers, and accepting Lifetime Achievement Awards in ballrooms where women weren't even allowed a few decades prior. I noticed something striking. Not a single photo featured my father at the helm of a project. "I built Whitford Properties from nothing but grit and a $5,000 loan from a cousin who didn't think I'd last a month," she said, the steel in her voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioner. "One office, one rotary phone, and 60 years of 60-hour weeks. Your father—" She paused, and a flicker of bitter disappointment crossed her face, deep and unyielding. "Grant inherited it. He didn't build it. He doesn't understand what it means to create something from the dirt up. He judges worth by credentials, by the Ivy League seal on a diploma, by a person's ability to perform in a boardroom symphony. He's forgotten that the most important work happens in the basement." She leaned forward, the scent of her lavender soap mixing with the medicinal smell of her treatments. "I judge people by how they treat those who can't fight back. And you, Harper, you're the only one in this bloodline who knows how to be kind without an ulterior motive." She pressed the mahogany box into my hands again, her grip tightening with a strength that defied her illness. "There is something inside that will help you when the cold front finally moves in. But you're not ready yet, and neither is Grant. He needs to show you exactly who he is before you can tear down what he thinks he owns. 18 months later, she was gone. Pancreatic cancer, a silent, aggressive predator that took her in the dead of winter. I held her hand in the hospice, the only member of the Whitford family who stayed through the long, hollow hours of the night. The mahogany box remained unopened in my closet, a silent sentry waiting for the year 2024 to arrive. The betrayal finally arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in April 2024. It didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came with the sterile, digital ping of an email. Subject: Position restructuring. Confidential. Dear Miss Whitford, as part of our ongoing organizational optimization and strategic streamlining, your current position as administrative assistant will be eliminated, effective July 1st, 2024. HR will contact you regarding your severance options. I read it 3 times. The letters swam across my monitor, vibrating and rearranging themselves, but they couldn't hide the devastating message. They were firing me. They were cutting the invisible daughter out of the corporate family tree before Sloan took the throne. That evening, I stayed late, the office empty except for the low hum of the HVAC system. I was organizing files no one would ever look at, a final act of the slow daughter they expected. Through the thin, expensive wall separating my cubicle from my father's corner office, I heard voices. Grant and Penelope. "We can't have her here when Sloan officially takes over next month," my father was saying, his voice carrying that flat, executive coldness that made my skin crawl. "It looks bad for the brand. The CEO's sister working as a low-level secretary? People will ask questions we don't want to answer." "What kind of questions, Grant?" my mother asked, her response soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it hurt more. "Why she's not in a leadership role. Why we haven't promoted her in 2 years. Why she is the way she is." A long, heavy pause followed. "We've done everything we could for her, Penelope. Some children just don't have the internal architecture to succeed in this world. She needs to go. We'll give her a generous severance package, 6 months' pay. She can find something more suited to her limited abilities, somewhere out of the spotlight." I pressed my palm against the cold, white drywall. $42,000 a year. My studio apartment in Queens, shared with 2 roommates who were constantly arguing over the electric bill, cost $1,800 a month. I had no savings, no safety net. If I lost this job, I'd be facing the very real possibility of being homeless in the most expensive city on earth within 60 days. But the money wasn't what made my chest feel like it was being crushed by a hydraulic press. It was the realization settling into my bones like black ice. If I let them do this, if I accepted their version of who I was, I would spend the rest of my life as the family failure. Not because I had actually failed, but because they had never allowed me the oxygen to succeed. They had decided I was a shadow, and they were finally turning off the lights. Sloan's graduation party at the plaza was tomorrow. I stood there in the darkened office, the city lights of Manhattan twinkling outside like cold, distant diamonds, and I knew that Grant Whitford was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He was about to announce Sloan as his sole heir, publicly disinheriting me in front of the entire industry. I left the office that night and went straight to my apartment. I didn't cry. I didn't pack. I reached into the back of my closet, pulled out the mahogany box, and felt the weight of Eliza's legacy. Grant thought he was optimizing his company by removing me. He didn't realize that he was just removing the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried, and exactly how to collapse the foundations of his pride. May 15th, 2024. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel wasn't just a room. It was a gilded cathedral of Manhattan excess, a place where the city's one-percenters gathered to validate their own existence through champagne and social cannibalism. 350 guests filled the space, a sea of bespoke tuxedos, silk gowns that cost more than a mid-size sedan, and the heavy metallic scent of ancient wealth. Crystal chandeliers, dripping with hand-cut glass, cast a prismatic, almost aggressive light across tables draped in Italian silk. A 12-piece orchestra tucked into the corner was playing Gershwin, Rhapsody in Blue, the unofficial anthem of a New York that only exists for people with seven-figure liquidity. This was Grant Whitford's kingdom, his meticulously curated stage, the arena where he performed his favorite role, the untouchable patriarch, the real estate mogul, the man who had successfully engineered a legacy without a single flaw. I stood in the massive arched entrance, tugging at the hem of my dress, a simple, charcoal black slip dress from Zara that I'd snagged for $79. It was the most I could justify on a salary that barely covered my Metro card and grocery staples. Surrounded by Vera Wang and Oscar de la Renta, I felt like a grainy black and white photograph in a high-definition world. My mother, Penelope, intercepted me before I could even find the bar. She looked lethal in a floor-length navy gown, her lips a perfect, clinical line of Chanel red. Penelope's gaze didn't just look at me. It conducted a forensic audit of my failures, traveling from my drugstore mascara down to my scuffed, three-season-old heels. "Harper," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum that barely hid her irritation. "You couldn't have found anything more appropriate? This isn't a funeral for your career, though you seem determined to make it one." "This is what I have, Mom," I replied, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice as a waiter passed us with a tray of beluga caviar blinis. "Well," she said, adjusting her diamond-encrusted Cartier bracelet with a sharp, dismissive click. "You'll be at table 27. It's near the service entrance. Try to stay behind the pillar. We don't need the Times photographer catching you in that outfit." She leaned closer, the overpowering floral suffocation of her Chanel No. 5 hitting me like a physical blow. "Tonight is Sloane's night. Whatever resentment you think you're entitled to, whatever invisible daughter drama you're planning to internalize, keep it to yourself. Don't embarrass this family in front of the board." She walked away before I could respond, her silk train snapping against the marble floor like a whip. Table 27 was exactly what I expected, a Siberia of social standing, tucked behind a massive Corinthian pillar that smelled of floor wax and neglect. My table mates were distant third cousins from Connecticut and minor estate lawyers who hadn't seen a billable hour in a decade. From my seat, the main stage looked like a distant, unreachable planet. A massive backlit portrait of Sloane, in her Harvard regalia, dominated the room, topped by a banner that read, "Congratulations, Sloane Whitford, Harvard Law, Class of 2024. And then I saw him. Standing alone by the heavy oak doors was a silver-haired man in a charcoal gray suit that looked like it had been carved out of granite. He wasn't mingling. He wasn't drinking. He was just watching me, with the focused, predatory stillness of a man who had spent 40 years in the New York Supreme Court. Something cold and electric prickled down my spine. At 8:30 p.m., the orchestra stopped. The house lights dimmed to a dramatic golden amber, and a single powerful spotlight illuminated the stage where Grant Whitford stood, his crystal champagne flute raised like a scepter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Grant's voice boomed, amplified by a sound system that cost more than my entire college education. Thank you for joining us to celebrate an extraordinary young woman. Sloane graduated in the top 5% of her class at Harvard Law. She completed a prestigious clerkship with Justice Reynolds, and, as of last month, she hit the partner track at Sullivan and Cromwell in record-breaking time. The applause was deafening. Grant's voice swelled with a brand of pride he had never, not once, afforded to the daughter who spent her weekends studying the structural integrity of his empire in silence. But tonight, he continued, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced charisma of a cult leader, I'm not just celebrating her past. I'm announcing her future. Sloane, come join me. Sloane glided onto the stage, radiant in an emerald Valentino gown that caught the light like a gemstone. She looked every bit the heir apparent, the perfect, polished vessel for the Whitford legacy. Effective immediately, Grant announced, his voice carrying the finality of a courtroom verdict. Sloane Whitford will inherit my entire estate upon my passing. This includes the family residence at 740 Park Avenue, currently valued at $13 million, our private equity holdings, and most importantly, he paused for a theatrical, breathless second, the position of CEO of Whitford Properties the moment I step down. The room erupted into a standing ovation. Camera flashes strobed like lightning, capturing Sloane's performative, humble tears. 350 people were cheering, and not one of them glanced toward the shadowed corner of table 27. I was officially a ghost. I had been formally erased from my own bloodline, my name scrubbed from the ledgers of history in front of everyone who mattered in the 5 boroughs. The cousin beside me, a woman who spent her life chasing social invitations like a sport, leaned over, her eyes bright with malicious curiosity. Harper, right? Gosh, that was definitive. What does that mean for you? Do you even have a job on Monday? I opened my mouth, then closed it. The termination email in my inbox felt like a lead weight in my stomach. I'm figuring it out, I managed to whisper. The applause died down, the music resumed, and through the shifting crowd, the silver-haired man from the door began walking toward me. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, as if the entire room was merely an obstacle between him and his target. He stopped exactly at my table. Up close, he looked even more formidable. Early 60s, with deep-set, intelligent eyes, and the impeccable posture of a man who spent his life winning wars. Miss Whitford. I straightened in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. That's me. Can I help you? My name is Julian Vance. He pulled a business card from his breast pocket. Cream-colored, heavy stock, embossed with a logo that made my pulse jump. Morrison and Blake, attorneys at law. I was your grandmother's personal lawyer, the only one she trusted with the things that mattered. My grandmother, I whispered, the name Eliza feeling like a shield. She passed away 3 years ago. I remember the funeral. I'm aware, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, confidential register that cut through the Gershwin melody. She left something for you. She gave me very specific, very rigid instructions about when, and only when, this document was to be delivered. From inside his jacket, he produced a heavy cream envelope sealed with deep red wax and a notarized stamp that caught the light. What is this? Her will, the real one. Julian's eyes locked onto mine. The one your father doesn't know exists. The one he spent the last 5 years assuming he'd successfully suppressed. I stared at the envelope. The notary seal was dated September 12th, 2019, 5 months after that Sunday afternoon in her apartment when she'd handed me the mahogany box. 5 months after Grant had tried to strip her of her power. "I don't understand," I stammered, my fingers grazing the cool wax. "Eliza gave me explicit, binding instructions," Julian explained, his gaze flicking toward the stage, where Grant was still basking in the glow of his own ego. "I was to deliver this document to you on the exact day, at the exact hour, that your father publicly and formally disinherited you. I believe that just occurred 5 minutes ago." My hands were trembling so violently I almost dropped it. "Mr. Vance, what is in here?" For the first time, something resembling warmth, or perhaps just a very grim satisfaction, flickered in his eyes. "Mrs. Whitford told me to tell you. Give this to Harper on the day Grant shows her exactly who he is. By then, she'll be ready to show him exactly who she is." He straightened his silk tie. "I'll be available when the questions start. You have my private cell on that card. Don't wait too long, Miss Whitford. The clock is already ticking." He turned and disappeared into the crowd before I could even say thank you. I couldn't breathe in that ballroom. The air felt like it was being sucked out by the sheer weight of the secrets in my hand. I pushed through the service entrance, ignoring the startled looks from the catering staff, and found a deserted, fluorescent-lit hallway near the industrial kitchens. The distant thrum of the celebration sounded like a muffled heartbeat. My fingers shook as I broke the red wax seal. Inside were 3 pages of dense, terrifyingly precise legal text. A notarized signature from Eliza Margaret Whitford. A date, September 12th, 2019. I read slowly, forcing my dyslexic eyes to lock onto the letters until they stopped swimming and stood still. "I, Eliza Margaret Whitford, being of sound mind and body, do hereby revoke all previous testamentary documents and declare this to be my last will and testament." My eyes caught on a paragraph near the center of the page. "To my granddaughter, Harper Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my voting shares in Whitford Properties, LLC, currently valued at approximately $47 million, along with all associated voting rights and board-level control." I read it again and again. 51%. Controlling interest. The hammer of the gods. The will continued. "This bequest is made with full, documented knowledge of my son Grant's treatment of Harper. She has been systematically excluded, diminished, and denied opportunity, not due to any lack of inherent ability, but due to a catastrophic lack of familial support. Harper is not slow. Harper was abandoned by the people who should have championed her. I will not allow her father's prejudice to dictate the future of the empire I built." A sob caught in my throat, hot and jagged. Grandma had seen me. She had seen the copy room, the $42,000 salary, the "also here" comments at Christmas. She'd seen it all, and she had built a legal bunker for me 3 years before she died. But then I saw the condition clause. To activate this bequest, Harper must formally request an emergency board meeting within 72 hours of receiving this document. Failure to act within this window will render this will null and void, and all assets shall transfer per my 2015 testament. 72 hours. The deadline would fall at exactly 8:30 p.m. on May 18th. I leaned against the cold industrial wall of the plaza hallway, the document clutched to my chest like a weapon. My grandmother hadn't just given me an inheritance, she had given me a countdown. She had given me the power to destroy my father's career, to reclaim my name, and to seize the throne Sloane thought was already hers. I looked at the heavy oak doors leading back into the ballroom. Behind them, my father was probably toasting to a future where I didn't exist. I felt the mahogany box in my mental closet finally click open. The invisible daughter was gone. The majority shareholder had arrived. Julian Vance was waiting by the coat check when I emerged, my eyes red, but my spine like iron. "You read the 72-hour clause," he said. It wasn't a question. "Why?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why the deadline?" "Eliza knew you, Miss Whitford." He handed me a second card, this one with a handwritten personal number. "She knew that if she gave you unlimited time, your kindness, or your fear, might convince you to stay silent. The deadline isn't a punishment. It's permission. Permission to stop waiting for your family to love you and to start making them respect you." I looked at the Whitford name embossed on the ballroom doors. "I want to proceed," I said, the words feeling like the first honest thing I'd said in years. "Help me draft the request. We're taking the boardroom." May 18th, 2024, 9:45 a.m., Whitford Tower. The elevator doors hissed open on the 42nd floor, revealing a sanctuary of brushed steel, Italian marble, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic, predatory view of the Manhattan skyline. This was the nerve center of Whitford Properties, a place where multi-billion-dollar dreams were signed into reality, and where, until today, I had been nothing more than the girl who refilled the toner cartridges. I stepped out into the lobby, wearing a borrowed gray blazer from my roommate. It was 2 sizes too big at the shoulders, making me look like a child trying to play dress-up in a Shark Tank. I was carrying a distressed leather portfolio I'd snagged from a Goodwill in Queens for $12, but inside it lay a document that carried the weight of a nuclear strike. The security guard at the double mahogany doors to the boardroom held up a massive gloved hand. "Name?" "Harper Whitford." He checked his high-definition tablet, his brow furrowing as he scrolled through the authorized attendee list. "You're not on the list for this session, ma'am. This is a restricted executive meeting." "I'm a full-time employee of Whitford Properties, and I have urgent fiduciary business with the board of directors," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, despite the fact that my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Ma'am, I can't let you—" "Is there a problem here?" Sloane's voice cut through the air like a localized cold front. She appeared at the end of the hallway, looking immaculate in a navy blue power suit with the silk Hermes scarf knotted perfectly at her throat. She was the living embodiment of corporate perfection, the golden child who had never known the indignity of a shared apartment or a maxed-out credit card. "Sloane," I said, the name feeling like ash in my mouth. "Harper?" Her smile was thin, performative, and didn't even come close to reaching her predatory eyes. "What on earth are you doing here? Did you lose your way to the copy room? This floor is for strategic operations." "I have information to present to the board, Sloane. Information that concerns the very foundation of this company." Sloane let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "Information? About what? The current inventory of paperclips? Harper, you don't even know what ROI stands for." "Return on investment, Sloane. It's not that complicated when you're not the one desperately trying to inflate it to please a father who will never be satisfied," I shot back. Before she could respond, the heavy mahogany doors swung open and Grant Whitford appeared, flanked by 2 senior VPs who looked like they'd been carved out of the same cold stone as the building. He looked at me with the same casual dismissal he'd used for a stain on his silk tie. Harper, go back to your desk, Grant commanded, his voice carrying that flat boardroom authority that had silenced me for 28 years. This meeting is for the board. It doesn't concern you. Actually, Grant, it does. A new voice boomed from inside the room. Madeline Sterling, the legendary Queen of Brooklyn, who had built half the borough alongside my grandmother in the 70s, appeared in the doorway. At 72, her silver hair was a crown of defiance, and her presence in that room carried more weight than Grant's entire executive suite. I invited her, Grant, Madeline said, her voice raspy from decades of construction site shouting and high-stakes negotiation. She has standing to address this board, and as a senior director with 32 years on this committee, I am exercising my right to give her the floor. Grant's jaw tightened so hard, I thought his teeth might crack. For a heartbeat, I thought he might physically block my path. But Madeline Sterling was the only person in New York he was actually afraid of. Fine. Grant's voice was pure ice. Let her in. We'll see how long it takes before she embarrasses herself and this family in front of our primary investors. The boardroom was smaller and more intimate than I'd imagined, which only made the tension feel more concentrated. It was an oval of polished walnut, surrounded by 12 high-backed leather chairs. Portraits of past executives lined the walls, including, I noticed, a massive oil painting of Grandma Eliza, her sharp, knowing eyes seeming to track my every move from above the marble fireplace. 12 board members took their seats. Grant took the head of the table, with Sloan positioned to his right. Not officially a board member yet, but sat there as the heir apparent to the kingdom. I was directed to a lone chair at the far end of the table, the corporate equivalent of the kids' table at Thanksgiving. In the corner, Julian Vance sat with his briefcase, catching my eye and nodding once with a grim legalistic approval. Robert Hartley, the board chairman, and a man who had known my grandmother since the Nixon administration, called the meeting to order. This emergency session was requested by Madeline Sterling, Richard Holloway, and Susan Parker. Madeline, you have the floor. Thank you, Robert, Madeline said, standing with the quiet power of a woman who didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. The matter I wish to address concerns a document that has recently come to light, a document that fundamentally alters the ownership structure and the legal governance of Whitford Properties. I yield my time to Ms. Harper Whitford. Every eye in the room pivoted toward me. Sloan smirked, leaning back and whispering something to the VP beside her. Grant leaned back in his chair with a theatrical display of boredom, checking his Patek Philippe watch as if counting the seconds until my failure. I stood up. My hands were steadier than I ever thought possible. Thank you, Mrs. Sterling, and thank you to the board for allowing me this time. I realize that to many of you, I am just a name on a payroll, a background character in the Whitford story. But what I'm about to present is not about me. It is about the legacy of Eliza Whitford and the future of this institution. I opened my $12 portfolio. Grant sighed audibly, a sound of profound performative exhaustion. Before we waste the board's valuable time on this melodrama, Grant said, standing up and buttoning his bespoke jacket with slow, deliberate precision. I need to provide some context. Harper is my daughter, and I love her in my own way, but she is fundamentally unqualified to address this board on any business matter. She has no legal training, no financial background, and no strategic experience. She struggles with basic literacy due to her dyslexia, a condition we have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to fix to no avail. Sloan chimed in, her tone dripping with the poisonous false sympathy. Harper also tends to act out when she feels overlooked. We believe this is a reaction to the announcement at my graduation party. Sibling jealousy is a powerful motivator, but it isn't a basis for corporate policy. Mr. Whitford, Robert Hartley's voice cut through the room like a judge's gavel. You will have your opportunity to respond, but Ms. Whitford has been granted this time, and she is entitled to use it without interruption. Grant sat down, his expression promising a corporate execution the moment this was over. Sloane caught my eye and silently mouthed the words, "You're embarrassing yourself." I looked at them both, my father, my sister, and I felt the last remnants of my need for their approval simply evaporate. They weren't trying to protect the company. They were trying to protect their monopoly on the truth. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," I said, pulling the heavy cream document from my portfolio. "I won't be discussing my reading ability today. I won't be discussing my jealousy. I will be discussing this." I held at the will, the red wax seal catching the morning sunlight streaming in from the East River. The room went absolutely, terrifyingly silent. This is the last will and testament of Eliza Margaret Whitford, the founder of this company, notarized on September 12th, 2019. Grant's face didn't just lose color. It turned a ghastly, translucent shade of gray. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice sounding thin and strangled. "My mother's will was executed in 2015. I have the original in the family vault." "You have a copy of her previous will, Grant," I said, my voice reaching a level of clinical, professional calm I didn't know I possessed. Under New York Estates Powers and Trusts law, a subsequent valid will automatically revokes all prior testamentary documents. This will was executed 4 years after the one you hold. It was the result of her seeing exactly how you plan to run this company into the ground with your ego. I slid the document down the long walnut table to Robert Hartley. "Mr. Vance?" I gestured to the corner. "Would you please confirm the authenticity of this document for the record?" Julian Vance approached the table with the gravitas of a high priest. "I am Julian Vance, senior partner at Morrison & Blake. I served as Eliza Whitford's personal attorney for nearly 15 years. I can confirm this will was executed in my presence, witnessed by 2 independent notaries, and the original is currently held in an escrow vault at Chase Private Client. It is bulletproof." Robert Hartley studied the document, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "This will, it bequeaths 51% of Whitford Properties' voting shares to—" He looked up at me with a mix of shock and dawning respect. "To you, Ms. Whitford." A low murmur rippled around the table like an approaching storm. "That's a forgery," Sloane snapped, standing up so fast her chair screeched against the marble. "Harper, you finally lost your mind. You think you can just print a document and steal a century of work?" "It is not a forgery, Sloane." Julian's response was immediate and cold. "And I would strongly advise you against making public accusations of fraud against a senior partner of Morrison & Blake without a shred of evidence. Our reputation in this city is older than your father's career." Grant slammed his palm onto the walnut table with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. "This is absurd. My mother was ill in 2019. She was being manipulated by an opportunistic daughter who spent her Sundays whispering poison into an old woman's ear." "Manipulated?" I pulled out my phone and connected it to the boardroom's high-end Bluetooth audio system. "Perhaps you'd like to explain the context of this then, Grant?" I pressed play. The room was suddenly filled with Grant's own voice, sharp, cold, and calculating. Eleanor is 81 years old. She doesn't understand modern real estate metrics. I am moving to reduce her voting rights to 10% immediately. If she resists, we'll move for a competency hearing. I want her off the board by Q3. The recording ended. The silence that followed was so absolute, you could hear the hum of the city 42 floors below. That recording. Grant's face had turned a mottled, dangerous shade of purple. That was a private board discussion. That is inadmissible. Actually, it's evidence, I countered. Evidence that Grandma Eliza was perfectly aware of your attempt to strip her of her power. She recorded it because she knew you tried to claim she was diminished the moment she stood in your way. She wrote this will 5 months after that meeting to protect the company from the man who tried to kill his own mother's legacy. Robert Hartley removed his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Ms. Whitford, would you please read the relevant passage aloud, for the record? I took a breath, the words no longer swimming on the page, but standing tall, like the skyscrapers outside. To my granddaughter, Harper Ann Whitford, I bequeath 51% of my shares in Whitford Properties, LLC, along with all associated voting rights. This bequest is made with full knowledge of my son Grant's treatment of Harper. She has been excluded and diminished, not due to a lack of ability, but due to a lack of support. Harper is not slow. Harper was abandoned, and I will not allow her father's prejudice to continue after my death. I looked directly at my father. His hands, I noticed with a strange sense of detachment, were trembling. The will concludes, I continued. I built this company from nothing. I choose who carries it forward. I choose Harper. Robert Hartley looked around the table at the 12 most powerful real estate minds in New York. Julian, you can confirm this is legally binding. The 2015 will is superseded, Robert. As of this moment, Harper Whitford is the majority shareholder of Whitford Properties. Madeline Sterling smiled quietly, leaning back in her chair. Richard Holloway and Susan Parker exchanged glances that spelled the end of Grant's reign. For the first time in 28 years, I watched my father look at me with something other than dismissal. It was pure, unadulterated fear. This doesn't prove she can run a company, Sloane whispered, her voice brittle and cracking. She's a secretary. She can't lead a board. I'm not asking to run the company alone, Sloane. I addressed the full board now, ignoring her entirely. I'm asking you to look at the facts. Under Grant's leadership, our environmental compliance has dropped by 20%, and our employee turnover in the Brooklyn division is the highest in the industry. He's been chasing prestige while the foundation is rotting. I stood taller. I have one motion to bring before this board. Grant rose from his seat, his eyes wild. Robert, this is a coup! You can't allow this! Sit down, Grant. Hartley's voice carried an unexpected, steel-like authority. Ms. Whitford has the floor. Grant sat. He looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, a titan made of straw. I am not proposing to fire Grant Whitford today, I said, and the shock in the room was palpable. Even Madeline looked surprised. What I am proposing is a formal vote of confidence. The board will decide right now whether Grant Whitford retains their trust as CEO. If the majority votes no confidence, he will be given 30 days to tender his resignation. If the majority votes confidence, I will honor that decision and remain as a silent majority shareholder until the next fiscal year. I met my sister's eyes. This isn't a revenge fantasy, Sloane. This is corporate governance. The same process Grandma Eliza established in our bylaws 40 years ago. If Dad has the board's confidence, he has nothing to fear. Robert Hartley studied me for a long, silent minute. Is there a second for this motion? Seconded. Madeline Sterling didn't hesitate for a second. Then we'll vote, Hartley announced. All those expressing confidence in Grant Whitford as CEO, raise your hands. 4 hands went up. Grant's oldest allies. People who owed their beach houses in the Hamptons to his favors. All those expressing no confidence. 7 hands rose, including Madeline's and Richard Holloway's. Robert Hartley waited a beat, then raised his own hand, making it 8. The motion carries, 8-4, Hartley said, the finality of it echoing like a thunderclap. Mr. Whitford, the board has spoken. Per Section 14.3 of the bylaws, you have 30 days to tender your resignation. Grant said nothing. He stood up and looked at me, really looked at me, for what felt like the first time in my life. I expected rage. I expected a scream. What I saw was the devastating recognition that he'd underestimated the one person he should have been teaching to lead. He had lost everything because he was too busy looking for a mirror instead of a partner. He walked out of the room without a word, his footsteps heavy on the marble. Sloane followed him, her emerald Valentino dress trailing behind her like the remnants of a fallen empire. The private corridor outside the boardroom smelled of lemon wax and the sudden, ozone-heavy chill of a dying empire. Grant caught me near the elevators, his breathing ragged, a sound that reminded me of a trapped animal. Penelope was with him. Someone must have summoned her from the plaza's penthouse suite the moment the vote was tallied. Her face was a wreckage of high society poise, her expensive waterproof mascara bleeding down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. You ungrateful, scheming... Grant's voice was a low, vibrating snarl, his finger trembling as he pointed it at my chest. Grant, please, not here, Penelope whispered, clutching his arm with a grip that looked desperate. Everyone is watching. The board hasn't even left the room. She just destroyed this family in front of 12 people! Ugh! Grant roared, ignoring the terrified look on the face of a passing junior analyst. I stood my ground, my back against the cool, brushed steel doors of the elevator. I didn't destroy anything, Grant. I told the truth. I simply read the words Eliza wrote 5 years ago. The truth? Grant laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that echoed off the marble. Your grandmother was a senile old woman, being manipulated by a lawyer who saw an opening. Julian Vance probably drafted that will himself. Grandma Eliza wrote that will 5 months after you tried to strip her of her voting rights, Grant. I countered, my voice steady enough to cut through his rage. She did it because she finally saw exactly who you were. You didn't lose today because I betrayed you. You lost because you betrayed her 60 years of work by turning it into a vanity project for your own ego. Penelope stepped forward, the scent of her Chanel No. 5 now mixed with the salty, metallic tang of her tears. Harper, sweetheart, you have to understand. We were only trying to protect you. You've always struggled with... things. We didn't want to put the pressure of this industry on someone who wasn't built for it. You didn't protect me, Mom. You erased me. 28 years of silence finally crystallized into a single, sharp sentence. Every Christmas dinner where you talked over me. Every family photo where you positioned me in the back. every conversation where you acted like I was a tragic secret instead of a daughter. That wasn't protection. That was abandonment in a designer dress. "That's not fair," she whispered, looking like I had physically struck her. "You're right. It wasn't fair," I said, meeting her eyes with a clarity I hadn't possessed since I was 7 years old. I spent my whole life trying to prove I was worthy of the Whitford name. I'm done proving. The documents speak for themselves. You have 30 days to help Grant pack his office. Grant grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "This isn't over. We'll contest the will. We'll hire the best litigation team in the city." "You'll lose," I said, pulling free with a force that surprised even me. "And you know it. Because Eliza Margaret Whitford planned for every contingency, including your predictable rage. Julian Vance has the original, and Madeline Sterling has the board. You're done, Grant." I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed on my parents' faces, on the man who had dismissed me and the woman who had enabled him. I leaned against the mirrored wall, finally allowing myself to breathe. The adrenaline that had carried me through the boardroom began to ebb, leaving a heavy, hollow grief in its wake. I'd just severed 28 years of hope. The hope that if I were just patient enough, quiet enough, or successful enough, they would eventually see me. That hope was dead. I had killed it with a notarized signature. By the time the elevator reached the lobby, I had wiped my eyes and straightened my borrowed, oversized blazer. Julian Vance was waiting by the security desk. "That was remarkable, Miss Whitford," he said, falling into step beside me as we walked out into the Manhattan sunlight. "It was necessary, Julian," I replied. "What happens now?" "Now I go home to Queens. I sleep, and I try to figure out what my life looks like without the family I thought I had, and without the shadow I've been living in." Julian nodded. "The board will want to meet with you on Monday to discuss transition plans. Robert Hartley is already talking about your long-term role in the executive suite." "I don't want to be CEO, Julian. I never did." We stopped at the revolving doors. "I just want the company Eliza built to be run by people who actually care about the community it's built on, not people who see it as a personal ATM. Today, I just need to be Harper. Tomorrow I start building something that doesn't require a mahogany table." May 19th, 2024. Grant Whitford signed his formal resignation at 4 p.m. I wasn't there to watch him do it. I learned about it through an encrypted email from Robert Hartley. "Miss Whitford, your father has tendered his resignation, effective June 15th. The board has appointed me as interim CEO while we conduct a global search for permanent leadership. Additionally, the board has voted unanimously to offer you a formal position, Strategic Advisor for Sustainable Development. This role gives you a permanent seat at the table without the operational burden of the CEO office. We look forward to your insight." I read the email 3 times, the old dyslexic habit of double-checking for hidden traps. I forwarded it to Julian for review. His response came within an hour. "Fair offer, no hidden strings. They're terrified of your 51%, but they also respect the way you handled the vote. Congratulations, Harper." That evening, an all-staff email went out to the 400 employees of Whitford Properties. The news hit the New York Business Journal by the following morning. "Founder's granddaughter takes control after secret will surfaces." The article didn't name me directly, but in the tight-knit, gossip-fueled circles of Manhattan real estate, everyone knew exactly who had just pulled off the heist of the decade. Grant and Penelope canceled their appearance at the Metropolitan Museum Gala, citing health reasons through a high-priced publicist. Two of our biggest investment partners requested personal meetings with me at a coffee shop in Soho. "We've had concerns about Grant's autocratic management style for years," one admitted to me over an espresso. "Your grandmother built something visionary. We're relieved to see her DNA back in the boardroom." The social fallout rippled outward. Invitations to Hampton's charity auctions suddenly dried up for my parents. The Whitford name, which had once opened every door on the Upper East Side, now carried a silent asterisk of scandal. I didn't celebrate their humiliation, but I didn't mourn it either. For the first time, the power to choose was mine. August 2024. 2 months after the board meeting, Sloane called me. We met on a bench near Bethesda Fountain in Central Park. The August heat was thick and humid, pressing down like a weight. Sloane looked different. The armor of corporate perfection she'd worn since she was 6 had finally cracked. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a messy, uncharacteristic bun. "I've been in therapy, Harper," she said without preamble. "Since May, 3 times a week." "That's good, Sloane," I said, watching a tourist boat drift across the lake. "It's brutal," she laughed, a sound that finally felt genuine. "Turns out being the golden child isn't actually a gift. It's a cage built by a man who only loves success, not people. I realized that if I defended you back then, I became a target too. I was a coward because I didn't want to lose my seat at a table that wasn't even mine." "You weren't protecting me, Sloane." "No, I was protecting my status," she admitted, her voice cracking for the first time. "I see you now, Harper. I really see you. And I'm so sorry I didn't look sooner. I'm sorry I let them call you slow when you were the only one fast enough to see the cliff we were heading for." We sat in silence. Two sisters who had grown up in the same mansion as complete strangers. "I can't go back to how things were, Sloane," I said finally. "But I'm not interested in staying enemies. Maybe we start over from scratch. No hierarchies. Just sisters." Sloane nodded, her eyes filling with tears. November 2024. 6 months after the Plaza coronation, I moved into my own apartment in Brooklyn Heights. It was a pre-war 1-bedroom with high ceilings and a view of the Brooklyn Bridge. The same bridge Eliza had walked across to open her first office in 1965. My new salary as Director of Sustainable Development was $185,000 a year, plus the quarterly dividends from my 51% stake. My new division focused on ESG metrics, green building practices, and urban revitalization, the kind of innovation Eliza would have championed. Grant calls me once a month now. Our conversations are short, polite, and centered on the weather or my new apartment. We both pretend the boardroom battle didn't happen, because it's the only way he can cope with the loss. Penelope and I have lunch every other week at a bistro in Midtown. Slowly, awkwardly, she's learning to see me as a person instead of a problem. It's not the mother-daughter bond I dreamed of, but it's honest. And honesty is the only inheritance I ever truly wanted. On the wall of my new office, I've hung Eliza's original 1965 partnership agreement. Sometimes, when the evening light hits the mahogany frame, I can almost see her smiling. "You did it, Harp," I can hear her whisper. 6 months ago, I was invisible. Now, I am finally fully myself. Looking back, I realized that Eliza didn't leave me the majority shares because I was better than Sloane. She left them to me because she knew I wouldn't let power corrupt my character the way it had corrupted Grant's. My dyslexia wasn't my flaw. It was the filter that allowed me to see the truth when everyone else was blinded by the prestige. If you're watching this and you recognize yourself in my story, if you've ever been the overlooked one, the dismissed one, the one they said would never amount to anything, I want you to know something. You don't need a secret inheritance to prove your value. You just need to give yourself permission to stop seeking approval from people who will never give it. Boundaries aren't walls, they're doors. They let you decide who gets access to your life and on what terms. My family hurt me for 28 years, but I didn't need to hurt them back to find peace. I just needed to stop waiting for them to see me and start seeing myself. That's the real inheritance Eliza left me. And nobody can ever take that away.